Night settled over the John B Connally Unit like a heavy blanket. Calm and predictable, exactly. The way a high-security prison should feel. Guards walked their usual routes. Cameras blinked. Steadily. The radios crackled with routine reports. Nothing looked unusual, nothing looked suspicious. But beneath that stillness, beneath that perfect order, a storm was quietly forming. A storm that would shatter the image of an unbreakable American prison. Inside the walls, 7 inmates were watching, waiting, and calculating. These were not petty criminals. These were men serving life sentences for murder, armed robbery, and violent crimes. Men who had decided that tonight freedom was not a dream. Freedom was a plan, and that plan required precision, silence, and an unshakable willingness to cross every line. In a few hours, America would wake up to a nightmare headline. 7 dangerous inmates have escaped from one of Texas's most secure prisons. The event would trigger a nationwide manhunt, spark panic across states, and become one of the most notorious escapes in modern American history. They would be remembered forever as the Texas 7. The John B Connally Unit in South Texas had a reputation. Escape was impossible. Its security was considered airtight. Layers of fencing, armed towers, trained officers, and constant surveillance. For years, guards believed no one could beat the system. But what they did not know was that 7 inmates had spent months studying routines, timing patterns, weak spots, and human behavior. The first phase of the plan relied on a simple tactic: distraction. The inmates understood that after lunch, guard activity slowed down. Officers became more comfortable. Movements inside the facility blended into routine. It was the perfect window. Their first target was a civilian maintenance worker. The conversation began casually, just harmless talk. But slowly the tone shifted. The worker was cornered, overpowered, and subdued. His uniform, identification, and tools became the group's first major advantage. Inside a prison, a uniform is power. It opens doors that inmates can only dream of. Next came the guards. One by one, the Texas 7 isolated them. Some were caught off guard, others threatened. Every encounter was fast, silent, and disciplined. They tied the guards, took their radios, keys, and even weapons. Their confidence grew with each step. They were no longer inmates fighting the system. They were men dismantling it from within. The heart of their plan was the gatehouse, the central command post. Whoever controlled the gatehouse controlled the prison. Doors, communication lines, and security systems were all connected to this point. Taking it over meant they could move freely. The moment they seized the gatehouse, the escape transformed from possible to inevitable. They now had uniforms, weapons, radios, and the authority to act like prison staff. No one questioned them. No one suspected the truth. Their final step was bold, using a maintenance truck that regularly traveled in and out of the unit. Wearing stolen uniforms and using official radio language, they contacted the exit gate, requesting it to be opened. To the guards watching the cameras, everything looked normal. The truck looked legitimate. The voices sounded like staff. There was no reason to hesitate. The gate opened. The truck drove forward. And in seconds, 7 of America's most dangerous inmates were free men. No alarms, no chase, no warning. The escape had been executed flawlessly. By the time prison staff realized what had happened, the Texas 7 were already far from the facility planning their next moves. They knew that escape was only the beginning. From this point on, every hour would be a battle for survival. They needed money, shelter, weapons, vehicles, and false identities. They were prepared to steal, disguise, and even kill to stay ahead of the law. America would soon launch one of the largest manhunts in its history. Media outlets would cover the story nonstop. Families across Texas would lock their doors. Police agencies across multiple states would coordinate day and night. But on this night in the cold December air, the Texas 7 felt only one thing: freedom. For now. The moment the truck crossed the final gate and rolled onto the highway, a silent transformation took place inside the minds of the Texas 7. For months they had lived as prisoners. Now, with nothing but open road ahead, they were fugitives. But freedom came with a price. Every second outside the walls meant they were moving deeper into danger. They knew the prison system would not stay silent for long, and once the alarm spread, the entire state of Texas would be hunting them. Their first challenge was immediate. They needed distance. The prison was in a rural area, surrounded by long empty fields and quiet county roads. They could not afford to linger. The group forced the maintenance truck forward until they reached a remote spot where they abandoned it. Then they split briefly to steal a car from a nearby parking lot. It was old, but reliable enough to disappear into the back roads. Inside the stolen car, the 7 men sat together in tense silence. They were free yet trapped. By time, each of them understood that the first hours after an escape determined everything. If they made it through the night, their chances of staying ahead improved. If they hesitated even slightly, the entire mission could collapse. Their leader, George Rivas, watched the dark road stretching ahead of them. He knew escape was only phase 1. Phase 2 was survival. They needed clothing, money, supplies, and a place to hide. But nothing came without risk. Every store they entered, every person they encountered, every mile they drove could lead to a mistake. And in their situation, even a small mistake could end in death. By dawn, the prison had confirmed the escape. Sirens screamed across the unit as officers searched every building. Radios exploded with frantic communication. Soon, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice released the news to law enforcement agencies across the state. 7 inmates had escaped the most secure facility in the region. All were considered extremely dangerous. Authorities began locking down nearby towns. Patrol cars lined highways. Roadblocks appeared through the morning fog. Helicopters lifted off from regional airports to scan the land. Yet while Texas was waking up to the emergency, the 7 fugitives had already slipped deeper into the state. They stole another vehicle, changed clothes, and drove toward urban areas where the population was large enough to blend in. Rivas knew crowds were useful. In rural towns, outsiders stood out. In a big city, no one noticed an unfamiliar face. But they were not simply hiding. They were preparing. Their past lives as criminals had taught them that survival required resources. They needed cash. They needed weapons. They needed safe houses. They also needed absolute unity. An escape with 7 fugitives meant 7 personalities, 7 fears, and 7 levels of discipline. If even one man panicked, the entire group could fall apart. Rivas began assigning roles. Some would scout locations. Others would gather information. They study patterns, store layouts, police presence, and escape routes. Their military precision came from months of planning inside the prison walls. The freedom outside only sharpened their focus. Meanwhile, media networks across the country picked up the story. News anchors described the escape in dramatic detail. Photographs of the fugitives flashed across screens. The term Texas 7 became a national headline within hours. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed they had already fled the state. Others thought they were hiding in abandoned farms. Police agencies urged citizens to stay alert, report suspicious activity, and lock their doors. But the fugitives were not hiding in shadows. They were preparing for their next move, one that would push their escape into even darker territory. They needed money, and they needed it fast. This necessity led them to a decision that would change the course of the manhunt forever. As they traveled to new cities, they adopted different identities. They shaved their beards, changed hairstyles, wore secondhand clothes. Some acted like travelers. Others pretended to be workers passing through town. They walked through stores, restaurants, and parking lots, with calm confidence, avoiding police cars and public attention. But beneath the calm exterior, each man understood the reality. They were the most hunted fugitives in America. Every step could be their last step as free men. Night after night, they kept moving, sleeping in rotation, eyes always on the windows. Their growing desperation fueled their determination. They could not return to prison. They would rather die than be captured. And that resolve would soon lead them toward a violent confrontation that would shake the nation even more than the escape itself. They thought the hardest part was breaking out. They were wrong. The hardest part was surviving the world waiting outside. As the days passed, the Texas 7 grew bolder. They had moved from small towns to larger cities, always choosing places where crowds were big enough to hide their faces. But despite their careful planning, one truth followed them everywhere. They were running out of money. Freedom demanded resources. and every day on the run drained their supplies faster than they expected. Without a large sum of cash, they could not travel far. They could not disappear, and they could not avoid the tightening grip of law enforcement. Their leader, George Rivas, understood this better than anyone. He gathered the group inside a rundown trailer they had temporarily taken over. The air inside was tense. The men sat around a small wooden table, their faces hard, their eyes focused. Rivas explained what they all knew. If they wanted to survive, they needed a large amount of money quickly, and the only way to get it was through a major robbery. They began scouting locations across the city. Stores, shops, small businesses, nothing seemed significant enough. They needed a place with high cash flow, minimal security, and predictable activity. After days of watching and planning, they found their target. A sporting goods store that sold weapons, equipment, and carried thousands of dollars in holiday revenue. It was perfect. A store full of firearms and cash, staffed mostly by civilians who would not resist. An armed group. The plan required precision. They studied employee routines, opening and closing hours, customer traffic, and nearby patrol routes. They watched quietly from parking lots, from across the street, and even from inside the store, pretending to browse. The more they observed, the more confident they became. They believed this robbery would give them enough money and weapons to vanish for months. On the afternoon of December 24th, the Texas Seven walked into the store disguised as ordinary customers. Some held jackets casually over their arms to hide their weapons. Others pretended to be browsing shelves. Within seconds, the calm atmosphere shifted. They drew their guns, shouting orders, forcing employees to the ground. Panic spread through the store as the men moved with practiced coordination. They gathered cash registers, instructed employees to open safes, and began loading weapons into bags. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. But fate intervened in a tragic way. A local police officer, Officer Aubrey Hawkins, arrived in the parking lot responding to a silent alarm. He stepped out of his patrol car, unaware that 7 desperate fugitives were waiting inside. The moment he entered the store, the situation erupted into chaos. The Texas Seven fired without hesitation. Multiple shots rang out in rapid bursts. Within moments, Officer Hawkins fell, fatally wounded. The sound of gunfire echoed across the parking lot as the men rushed out, climbed into their stolen vehicles, and vanished into the night. The robbery succeeded, but the cost was enormous. The death of an officer transformed the escape from a prison story into a national crisis. News networks broke into programming to cover the killing. Law enforcement across the country intensified their pursuit. The Texas Seven were no longer just fugitives. They were now responsible for the murder of a police officer. Their freedom had bought them money and weapons, but it had also sealed their fate. From this moment on, the hunt for them would become relentless, unforgiving, and nationwide. They knew the world had changed. They just did not realize how soon it would close in on them. The murder of Officer Aubrey Hawkins changed the direction of the manhunt instantly. Overnight, the search for the Texas Seven turned into one of the most urgent and aggressive pursuits in modern American history. Police departments across states were ordered to remain on constant alert. Federal agencies stepped in. News outlets repeated the story every hour. The faces of the 7 fugitives appeared on every television screen, every newspaper front page, and every police bulletin board. The public was shaken. Families locked their doors even during daylight. Gas stations began posting flyers with the fugitives' photos. Restaurants, shops, and bus stations warned customers to stay cautious. The Texas Seven were no longer seen as clever escapees. They were now viewed as armed killers capable of extreme violence. The entire country felt the weight of their freedom. Meanwhile, the fugitives traveled deeper into hiding. They moved between states, avoiding main highways and using back roads to stay invisible. Every time they stopped at a motel, they paid in cash. Every time they entered a store, they kept their heads lowered. They spoke little, watched everything, and trusted no one. But as days passed, they realized something important. The robbery had given them resources, yet it had also made them recognizable everywhere they went. Their faces were too well known for them to walk freely without risk. Under pressure, they made a new plan. They would stay in a remote area, far from major cities, far from active patrols. After searching for a place where no one asked questions, they settled inside an isolated RV park in Colorado. The quiet mountains and sparse population offered them a place to breathe. They blended in by pretending to be Christian missionaries who traveled from town to town. They dressed conservatively, carried religious pamphlets, and spent days inside their trailers studying maps and planning their next moves. For a time, their disguise worked. Locals greeted them politely. No one suspected the truth, hiding behind the calm faces. But even in isolation, the walls were closing in. Television, broadcasts reached every home. And soon people in the area began recognizing small details they had seen on the news. A jawline, a voice, a gesture. Suspicion grew silently. The group sensed the tension. Every car that slowed down near the RV park made them glance at each other. Every knock on a door made their hearts tighten. They knew the police were getting closer, but they did not know how close. One evening, while the sun was setting behind the mountains, an announcement aired on a local television station. A viewer watching from a nearby cabin froze when he saw the program. The men living at the RV park looked identical to the fugitives on screen. Without hesitation, he called the police. The tip spread quickly through law enforcement channels. Units mobilized. Officers were instructed to move carefully, prepared for anything. The search that had stretched across states was finally beginning to narrow. Inside the RV, the 7 fugitives felt something shift in the air. A quiet dread settled over the room. They did not hear sirens yet, but instinct told them the moment they had feared was coming. The distance they had gained was disappearing. The world was catching up. Night settled over the RV park like a heavy curtain. The mountains stood dark and silent, but beneath the quiet surface, something dangerous was stirring. Inside the small trailer, the Texas 7 sat around a dim light. Maps spread across the table, cash stacked in uneven piles. They spoke in low voices, trying to decide their next move. Yet each man felt the same pressure, building. They knew eyes were turning toward them. For days they had sensed a shift in the air. Locals had become more observant. A neighbor lingered too long near the window. A store clerk stared a second too long at one of their faces. Suspicion was growing, and they could feel it eating into their disguise. The comfort they had found in the mountains was beginning to break apart. Then came the sound that confirmed their fears. A helicopter in the distance, barely a whisper at first, but unmistakable. Lights from the sky swept across the valley as the aircraft searched the ground below. The fugitives froze. They looked at one another without speaking, but the message was clear. They had been found, or they would be very soon. Hours earlier, law enforcement had received the tip that changed everything. A resident in the area reported that the men staying at the RV park looked exactly like the fugitives from the shore. The caller hesitated at first, uncertain and nervous, but the familiarity of the faces was too strong to ignore. When authorities verified the location, the plan to capture the group moved into motion. Officers were ordered to surround the area quietly and wait until daylight to strike with minimal risk to civilians. Inside the trailer, the 7 men argued in tense whispers. Some wanted to flee immediately. Others believed running would only expose them sooner. Dugan, calm but firm, tried to control the situation. He had always been the voice that kept the group steady, the one who understood how fear could destroy a plan, but even he felt the strain. This was nothing like the escape from the prison. This time they were surrounded by a nation ready to stop them at any cost. The night dragged on. Every sound outside the trailer made their hearts race. A dog barked in the distance. A car door closed somewhere near the road. A branch snapped under the weight of the wind. Each noise could have been a sign that officers were approaching. Sleep was impossible. As dawn approached, the sky turned pale and cold. The men prepared for whatever might come. They packed their bags quietly, loaded every weapon they had, and rehearsed escape. Routes they knew might fail. Tension filled the air like smoke. Then a sudden noise broke the silence. The crunch of tires on gravel. Slow, controlled, unmistakable. A vehicle was approaching the RV park with deliberate caution. The fugitives rushed to the windows and lowered the blinds. They saw shapes moving in the distance, shadows shifting with purpose. Law enforcement had arrived. The net that had stretched across states, highways, and mountains was finally tightening. Around them, the moment they had tried to outrun was now standing at their door. They knew the chase was about to reach its breaking point. Morning light crept slowly across the RV park, revealing the stillness of the mountains and the tension gathering beneath it. Inside the trailer, the Texas 7 stood inside a fragile shell of calm. Each man tightened his grip on his bag or weapon, trying to steady the fear they refused to show. They had outrun officers before, but this time felt different. This time there was no open road waiting for them. No easy disguise, no advantage left. Outside, law enforcement moved with practiced precision. Officers surrounded the park quietly, positioning themselves behind trees, vehicles, and rocks. They communicated in hushed tones, aware that one wrong step could lead to bloodshed. They had waited weeks for this moment. Now they wanted it to end without another life lost. The first call came through a loudspeaker asking the fugitives to surrender peacefully. The sound echoed through the valley, clear and commanding. Inside the RV, the men exchanged glances, their faces tightened. None of them wanted to go back to prison. For some, returning meant death. For others, it meant losing the only freedom they had tasted in years. Minutes passed with no answer. Officers repeated the command, stronger and more urgent. Birds scattered from trees at the sound. Car engines hummed in the distance. The mountain air felt heavy, as if holding its breath. Finally, one of the fugitives stepped to the door. His hands shook slightly as he glanced back at the others. They nodded once, silently agreeing that whatever happened next would define the end of their journey. He opened the door slowly. In an instant, bright lights and laser sights locked onto him. Officers shouted instructions. The man raised his hands, stepping forward with hesitant movements. The tension cracked. Another stepped out, then another, and one by one the remaining members followed. Their escape had stretched across states and held the nation's attention. But here, in the cold, morning air of a quiet mountain town, it dissolved. They surrendered without a fight, their strength drained by weeks of running, hiding, and waiting. As handcuffs clicked around their wrists, a chapter in American criminal history closed. The Texas 7 had reached the end of their road. Their final stand had not been a gun battle or a dramatic chase. It was a quiet moment in the shadow of the mountains where freedom slipped from their grasp, at last. The story of the Texas 7 did not end with their capture. Even behind bars, their legend grew. Newspapers replayed the details of the daring escape. Television specials reconstructed the months they had spent on the run. True crime enthusiasts debated every decision, every move, every mistake. To the public, they had become more than fugitives. They were symbols of audacity, planning, and rebellion against a system thought to be impenetrable. Inside the prisons where they were returned, the 7 men faced harsher security, longer sentences, and constant surveillance. Yet even in confinement, the echoes of their freedom haunted them. Every guard knew their names, every officer recalled the fear of that December escape. The prisons themselves became monuments to the audacity of their plan. Officers, shared stories with younger recruits about the night the Texas 7 vanished and how close they had come to disappearing forever. The families of the victims, particularly that of Officer Aubrey Hawkins, carried pain that would not fade. His death remained a dark mark on the history of the escape. Every recounting reminded the nation that behind every legend, real lives had been shattered. The audacity of the Texas 7 brought fame, but it also left a trail of grief and loss that could never be undone. Yet fascination endured. Scholars, journalists, and filmmakers studied the escape, dissecting the strategy and daring. How could 7 men bound by confinement and desperation outsmart an entire prison system? The answers were a mixture of timing, courage, and cold calculation. Their story became a benchmark, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration for those intrigued by crime and the human drive for freedom. The Texas 7 had proven that even the most secure systems could be challenged. They had rewritten the rules of survival for fugitives. They had shown the world the power of patience, planning, and teamwork. But they had also shown the consequences of choices made in desperation. Freedom was thrilling, but it carried risk. Every step outside the prison walls had been earned with danger, and every moment of survival tested their limits. Decades later, The legend lives on. Books, documentaries, and articles continue to explore the escape. The Texas Seven are remembered not just for their crime, but for their audacity, their intelligence, and the fear they instilled in a nation that believed it was untouchable. The escape may have ended, but the story remains a timeless testament to one simple truth. Even the most meticulous chains cannot contain a mind determined to break free.